The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator.
Imagine waking up to 500,000 jobs gone, factories idling, ports silent, and farmers staring at mountains of unsold crops. The unshakable superpower, the United States, was suddenly exposed as vulnerable. And the shocker, it wasn't China, Russia, or Europe. It was Canada, the trusted neighbor and ally, showing the world that even the mightiest nation can falter when arrogance meets strategy. It all started with one reckless gamble. Trump's trade war promised to be easy to win. But Canada didn't fold. Instead, they quietly prepared a response that would humiliate the US, shift global trade, and change the rules forever. This isn't just about politics or tariffs. It's about power, pride, and the catastrophic cost of underestimating the unexpected. The shattering of an illusion. The morning headlines hit like a sledgehammer. 500,000 American jobs vanished almost overnight. The unthinkable had happened.
Has gone from what we thought was 147,000 a month to now just 70,000 a month. So 1.7 million jobs is now 847,000 jobs created over that period.
Farmers stared helplessly at mountains of unsold grain, ports fell eerily silent, and manufacturing giants reported staggering losses. And yet, the source of this catastrophe was almost absurd in its simplicity. It wasn't China, Russia, or Europe who struck the fatal blow. It was Canada. The neighbor that America had always hailed as its closest ally, the partner trusted above all others, had just exposed the fragility of the United States' economic might. For decades, Americans had been told their country was unassailable, an unstoppable superpower, a leader whose economy was untouchable. But that myth was obliterated, and the world watched, jaws agape, as the cracks appeared in plain sight. It all started with one decision, seemingly bold yet recklessly naive: Donald Trump's trade war. Standing before cheering supporters, he proclaimed that trade wars were easy to win. Tariffs, in his view, were not nuanced instruments of policy. They were simple, blunt weapons to intimidate allies and foes alike. His target wasn't a distant rival. It wasn't China or the European Union initially. It was Canada. This shocked diplomats and economists around the globe. Canada was no minor player. It was deeply entwined with the US economy. Millions of American jobs depended on the seamless flow of goods across the border. Cars, steel, energy, agriculture, the economic lifeblood of both nations moved daily along this shared border. Yet Trump, ignoring centuries of partnership and integration, imposed tariffs as if punishing a long-standing enemy. Canada's warning came swiftly. Prime Minister Mark Carney, reportedly the subject of Trump's private mockery, cautioned that pushing Canada too far would have consequences. History had taught that Canadians didn't back down easily. But Trump, buoyed by arrogance, dismissed the warning. He doubled down, belittled Canada's sovereignty, and pressed forward with his economic assault. What he didn't realize was that Canada had no intention of capitulating. Behind closed doors, officials began planning a counterstrike, silent, strategic, and devastating. This resistance didn't manifest as a public show of defiance. No grand announcements, no fiery speeches. It was subtler, yet far more lethal. Ordinary Canadians, outraged by insults and tariffs, took action themselves. Families canceled shopping trips across the border. Tourists stayed home from Florida and New York, and ski resorts once bustling with Americans found their slopes empty. If America treated Canada as an enemy, Canadians quietly decided to spend their money elsewhere. The effects were immediate. Tourism, once a $20 billion annual boon to the US economy, collapsed almost instantly.
New numbers from Statistics Canada show return trips from the US in May dropped 32% compared to last year.
Within months, 140,000 American jobs dependent on Canadian visitors disappeared. Hotels went half empty, restaurants sat silent, and small businesses near the border faced despair. But Canadians didn't stop at tourism. They initiated a coordinated boycott, choosing European, Asian, and domestic alternatives over American products. Analysts later described it as one of the most sophisticated civilian-led economic operations in modern history. No politicians orchestrated the effort, no military mobilized, just millions of ordinary citizens quietly executing a strategy that humiliated the world's most powerful economy. The ripple effect spread beyond Canada. Observing the success of this resistance, other nations began to act. Europe, long frustrated with Trump's insults and tariff threats, adopted Canada's blueprint. Mexico reduced reliance on American goods, diversifying trade routes southward. Even Australia, an ally traditionally loyal to the US, quietly shifted its purchases elsewhere. And then came China, striking with ferocious retaliation. A 125% tariff on American exports that shut down one of the most lucrative markets on Earth. Trump's promise that other countries would pay for his trade wars backfired spectacularly. Instead, the US became the debtor, struggling to find buyers for exports while contracts evaporated and international trust evaporated along with them. The coordination among these nations was precise. Canada had lit a spark, and the rest of the world fanned it into an economic inferno. Trump believed he was playing a strategic game, but the world had flipped the board, and America was losing. Ports, once teeming with commerce, fell silent. Portland saw exports drop by half, Tacoma lost a third of its traffic, and Los Angeles, the nation's busiest port, experienced a 20% decline. These weren't minor setbacks. They were catastrophic blows, triggered directly by the trade war. Agriculture, the lifeblood of Trump's support base, suffered immensely. Soybeans had nowhere to go, corn contracts dissolved, and beef deals were snapped up by Brazil and Argentina. Farmers across the Midwest faced mountains of unsold grain, paying storage costs while their livelihoods decayed. Those who had cheered Trump's promises whispered the harsh truth. America first had abandoned them. Manufacturing was no safer. General Motors reported $1.1 billion in losses in a single quarter, while Stellantis hemorrhaged $2.7 billion. Plants idled, workers were laid off, and entire communities faced economic collapse. The energy sector, too, saw disaster unfold. For 40 consecutive days, not a single American LNG shipment reached China.
Liquefied natural gas is considered the least environmentally harmful of the fossil fuels. LNG produces about 30% less carbon dioxide than petroleum and about 45% less CO2 than coal.
The fastest-growing energy market in the world was closed to the United States. Behind the numbers were real people, real communities, real devastation. Families sold homes, factory workers packed decades of labor into boxes, and towns that had once thrived were hollowed overnight. What was meant to be a trade war victory had become economic self-destruction. And through it all, Canada was already moving to the next stage of its strategy. While America stumbled, Canada reinvented itself. Prime Minister Carney unveiled an industrial strategy aimed at reducing dependence on the United States and building stronger ties worldwide. Deals with the European Union, Asia, and South America flowed in rapidly. Canada didn't just survive the crisis, they thrived, capturing markets that the US had lost and building resilience against future American aggression. Farmers found new buyers for wheat, beef, and canola. Energy exporters accessed Asian demand while American LNG remained locked out. The message was clear. Canada would no longer play the role of the subordinate neighbor. Trump's tariffs, intended to isolate and punish, had inadvertently made Canada stronger. And Canada's success became a global blueprint. Nations worldwide, inspired by Canada, began diversifying trade, bypassing American markets, and neutralizing US leverage. For the first time since World War II, America wasn't the anchor of global stability. It had become the unpredictable partner, feared less, trusted less, and increasingly isolated. And at the human level, the story was tragic. 500,000 jobs vanished. Farmers in Iowa and Nebraska, trusting Trump's promises, faced barns full of rotting grain, forced to sell land that had belonged to their families for generations. Factory workers in Michigan and Ohio saw decades of labor vanish overnight as plants slowed, shifts were cut, and layoffs spread. Construction projects stalled, steel and lumber prices soared, and thousands of workers were left without employment. Those who had most fervently supported Trump, the rural families, small-town communities, blue-collar workers, were the ones who suffered most. Meanwhile, Trump remained insulated, living in luxury, golfing, and raising campaign funds, untouched by the consequences he had unleashed. The stage was set for the next chapter. What began as a boast about trade wars being easy to win had morphed into America's most humiliating economic defeat in recent history. 500,000 jobs lost, ports silent, farmers bankrupt, manufacturing giants bleeding billions, and the world watching, learning Canada's blueprint, and realizing for the first time that America's dominance wasn't unassailable. Canada hadn't used armies or weapons. They had used strategy, patience, and quiet defiance. They had proven that even a smaller nation could outmaneuver the superpower if pushed too far. And once Canada demonstrated the possibility, the world followed. Europe, Mexico, China, and Australia all adopted similar strategies, reshaping global trade to circumvent the United States. Trump promised America first, but what he delivered was America isolated. Allies no longer trusted the nation, rivals no longer feared it, and for the first time in generations, the United States stood exposed, vulnerable to arrogance and ignorance. The domino effect, how one country changed the world. By the time the United States began to grasp the scale of the disaster, it was already too late. Canada's quiet defiance had evolved into a blueprint that the rest of the world began to replicate. The global economic chessboard shifted while America fumbled with tweets, threats, and reactive measures. Europe, long frustrated with Trump's bluster, started restructuring supply chains to bypass U.S. suppliers entirely. Factories once reliant on American steel and machinery began looking east and south, creating new partnerships in Asia and Latin America. Mexico quietly reduced its dependence on U.S. goods, while Australia diversified its imports to Asia-Pacific markets. Even nations that had historically followed America's lead began to see that loyalty was no longer rewarded. Resilience and independence were. China's retaliation, the 125% tariff on U.S. exports, sent shockwaves through the American economy. What had once been one of the most lucrative markets evaporated almost overnight. Soybeans, wheat, and energy contracts that promised prosperity now became symbols of a failed gamble. U.S. exporters scrambled in panic, desperately searching for buyers that simply weren't there. Contracts dissolved, confidence evaporated, and global faith in America's reliability as a trading partner reached historic lows. The U.S., the supposed economic juggernaut, was suddenly at the mercy of countries it had long treated as secondary players. Ports, once bustling hubs of commerce and power, now reflected the grim reality of Washington's miscalculations. In Portland, shipping volume dropped by 50%. Tacoma saw a third of its freight vanish. Los Angeles, the nation's busiest port, lost nearly a fifth of its cargo traffic. And this wasn't just numbers on a report. It meant empty docks, idle trucks, and laid-off workers who suddenly had no income. The very arteries of American trade were clogging, suffocating the economic vitality of the nation Trump had claimed to protect. Agriculture, the backbone of Trump's base, was hit particularly hard. Farmers stared at mountains of unsold grain, helpless as contracts disappeared and buyers shifted to Canada, Brazil, and Argentina. Soybean and corn contracts that had been a lifeline evaporated. Beef deals were scooped up by foreign competitors. Storage costs soared as crops remained unsold, and farms that had been in families for generations faced foreclosure. The bitter irony was undeniable. The people who had most ardently supported Trump, rural farmers, small-town workers, were the ones bearing the brunt of the fallout. Manufacturing faced an equally dire reality. General Motors reported a staggering $1.1 billion loss in a single quarter, while Stellantis bled $2.7 billion. Plants slowed, shifts were cut, layoffs spread, and entire towns felt the ripple effect. Workers who had spent decades mastering their craft suddenly found themselves without jobs, their livelihoods reduced to uncertainty and fear. Even the energy sector, long considered America's trump card, suffered severe setbacks. 40 consecutive days without a single LNG shipment reaching China marked an unprecedented blow, closing off one of the world's fastest-growing markets and leaving exporters scrambling. But while the United States faltered, Canada was already moving forward. Prime Minister Carney didn't just retaliate, he rebuilt. He unveiled an ambitious industrial strategy designed to reduce dependency on the United States and diversify global trade. Within months, Canada had signed deals with Europe, Asia, and South America, cementing new markets for agriculture, energy, and technology. Farmers found buyers outside the U.S., energy exporters tapped into Asian demand, and industrial sectors thrived as Europe and Asia welcomed Canadian goods with open arms. The brilliance of Canada's response wasn't just in survival, it was in transformation. By turning adversity into opportunity, Canada strengthened its economic independence while America spiraled into isolation. Trump's tariffs, meant to intimidate, had instead forced Canada to innovate, adapt, and ultimately outmaneuver its larger neighbor. And once Canada proved it could resist and thrive, other nations took notice. The ripple effect became a wave. Europe, Mexico, China, Australia, each adopted Canada's playbook. They diversified trade, bypassed American supply chains, and reduced dependence on U.S. markets. No longer could Washington rely on its traditional influence. The American-first rhetoric that once commanded global attention now echoed hollowly, replaced by strategies emphasizing resilience, diversification, and mutual trust. At home, the human toll continued to mount. Families across the Midwest and industrial heartlands felt the sharp edge of economic collapse. Farmers faced barns full of rotting crops, many forced to auction off decades-old family land. Factory workers were laid off in record numbers as plants slowed or shuttered entirely. Construction projects stalled under surging steel and lumber prices, leaving thousands unemployed. Communities that had long relied on American industry and trade found themselves hollowed out, their livelihoods disrupted by a policy that was supposed to protect them. And yet, Trump remained insulated from the consequences. Golfing at Mar-a-Lago, raising campaign funds, and enjoying a lifestyle untouched by economic realities, he remained disconnected from the human devastation his policies had caused. For those who had believed in his promises, farmers, workers, small-town families, the contrast between rhetoric and reality was devastating. The America he had promised was gone. The America he delivered was isolated, weakened, and humiliated on the world stage. The lesson, as clear as it was tragic, lay in the stark contrast between leadership driven by ego and leadership driven by strategy. Canada had shown that preparation, patience, and disciplined execution could defeat even the most powerful adversary. By turning a crisis into an opportunity, Canada not only survived the trade war, but reshaped global trade in its favor. And the world noticed. The consequences of Trump's miscalculations were far-reaching. 500,000 American jobs vanished, ports fell silent, manufacturing giants bled billions, and farmers were left bankrupt. International confidence in America plummeted. Allies no longer trusted Washington, rivals no longer feared it, and the world began to chart a path that bypassed U.S. influence. The very foundation of American economic power, the trust, the reliability, the interconnectedness, was eroding before the eyes of the global community. Canada's success became a symbol, a warning, and a blueprint. Even smaller nations realized that with strategy, unity, and patience, the superpower could be countered. Europe, Mexico, China, and Australia all followed suit, restructuring supply chains, redirecting trade, and reducing exposure to U.S. markets. What had begun as a quiet Canadian resistance became a global movement, one that challenged the notion of American invincibility for the first time in generations. At its core, the tragedy was human. 500,000 jobs lost, families displaced, farmers ruined, factory towns abandoned. Communities that once thrived on trade and industry found themselves struggling to survive. And the irony was bitterest of all. Those who believed most fervently in Trump's promises, small-town workers, rural families, blue-collar Americans, were the ones paying the steepest price. Meanwhile, Canada's message was clear: resilience, strategy, and smart partnerships trump intimidation and threats. They didn't destroy America with armies or weapons. They did it with discipline, planning, and quiet defiance. The result was a fundamental reshaping of global economics, a blueprint that nations around the world quickly adopted. Trump's boast that trade wars were easy to win ended in one of the most humiliating economic defeats in modern American history. 500,000 jobs lost, ports silent, farmers bankrupted, industries hemorrhaging billions, and the global stage learning Canada's blueprint, all while the man who promised America first remained insulated from the disaster. The ultimate lesson was stark. Power built on arrogance is fragile. Influence rooted in fear and threats can crumble overnight. Leadership driven by ego rather than strategy leaves even the strongest nations exposed. Canada proved that with vision, patience, and smart action, even a smaller nation could withstand and surpass a superpower. And the world, watching closely, would never forget the day America's illusion of invincibility shattered. And so, the story closes not with fanfare, but with a lesson written in stark reality. What began as a boast, trade wars are easy to win, ended as America's most devastating economic setback in decades. 500,000 jobs vanished, ports fell silent, factories slowed to a crawl, and farmers were left staring at mountains of unsold crops. The very people who had believed in Trump's promises, the small-town workers, rural families, and blue-collar communities, were the ones who paid the steepest price. Meanwhile, Canada, underestimated and underestimated again, had quietly rewritten the rules of global power. They didn't strike with weapons, they didn't make headlines with threats, they simply outsmarted the superpower. Their strategy became a template the world eagerly followed. Europe, Mexico, China, and Australia all saw what was possible. Resilience, patience, and smart action could outmaneuver arrogance. America, once the anchor of the global economy, had become the unpredictable, isolated partner. This isn't just a tale of trade, tariffs, and lost contracts. It's a story about power, ego, and the fragility of dominance. It's about how the choices of a few can ripple across continents, upending lives, economies, and alliances. Canada proved that even a smaller nation, when pushed too far, could stand firm and change the rules forever. And as the world adjusts, one truth remains undeniable. America's illusion of invincibility has been shattered. Allies no longer take loyalty for granted. Rivals no longer act in fear. And the people who were meant to benefit the most are still paying the price. Because in the end, this isn't a story about who lost a trade war. It's a story about what happens when ego drives a nation and humility is nowhere to be found. Canada showed the world it's never too small, never too quiet, and never too patient to rewrite the rules. And the question now lingers: if a neighbor can change the game, what happens when the entire world follows? And make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter of this royal drama is one you won't want to miss.